My parents locked their bedroom for 17 years. I broke in and found my dead brother asking me to kill him. Growing up in our two-story colonial house in Millbrook Heights, my family had exactly one rule that was never, ever negotiated. You do not enter Mom and Dad's bedroom. The heavy oak door with its brass handle stayed locked 24/7, and I wasn't even allowed to knock if there was an emergency, not even if the house was burning down around us. But there was something else that made my skin crawl every single night, something that haunted my childhood dreams and left me staring at my bedroom ceiling until dawn. The tapping. It started when I was 6 years old, just after we moved into this house on Maple Street. A soft, rhythmic thumping coming from inside their bedroom wall. Tap, tap, tap. Always at the same steady pace, always from the same spot on the wall that shared my bedroom, and always between midnight and sunrise. The sound was so consistent you could set a clock by it. Every night, like clockwork, the tapping would begin. Sometimes it lasted for minutes, sometimes for hours. I'd lie in my little twin bed with my stuffed elephant, counting the beats and wondering what could possibly make such a sound. When I finally worked up the courage to ask my parents about it during Sunday dinner, we were having Mom's famous pot roast with mashed potatoes. My dad's face went completely white. His fork clattered against his plate, and the silence in our dining room became so thick you could cut it with a knife. "There is no tapping sound," he said, his voice deadly quiet and controlled in a way that made my 7-year-old heart skip a beat. "And if you mention this again, Audrey, the consequences will be something you cannot begin to imagine." My mom just stared at her plate, gripping her steak knife so hard her knuckles turned bone white. The veins in her hands stood out like blue road maps, and I could see her jaw muscles working as she clenched her teeth. That's when I knew something was seriously, terrifyingly wrong in our perfect suburban home. The look that passed between my parents in that moment was something I'd never seen before, a mixture of panic, grief, and something darker that I couldn't name. It was the look of people sharing a terrible secret, one so awful it could destroy everything they'd built together. From that day forward, the tapping became my secret burden to bear. Every night, I'd pull my pillow over my head and try to block out the sound, but it seemed to seep through everything, through the pillow, through my hands pressed against my ears, through my very bones. It became the soundtrack to my childhood, a constant reminder that something was very, very wrong behind that locked door. For 11 long years, I lived with that sound haunting every night of my childhood in Millbrook Heights. The tapping became as much a part of my routine as brushing my teeth or eating breakfast. Sometimes, when my curiosity got the better of me, I'd sneak out of my room in my pink fuzzy slippers and press my ear against the hallway wall, right where it connected to my parents' bedroom. That's when I heard something that made my blood run cold, something else underneath the rhythmic tapping. A faint voice that sounded human, but distorted somehow, like someone speaking through water or from very far away. It was impossible to make out the words no matter how hard I pressed my ear against the floral wallpaper, but the tone was unmistakable. It was pleading, desperate, filled with a kind of anguish that made my chest tight with fear. The voice always came between the tapping sounds, during those brief moments of silence. It would whisper urgently for maybe 10 or 15 seconds, then stop abruptly when the tapping resumed. I spent countless nights trying to decipher what it was saying, but the words remained maddeningly unclear. My mom started acting stranger as I got older, especially during my middle school years. She'd disappear into that forbidden bedroom for hours at a time, always carrying a cup of chamomile tea and sometimes a plate of chocolate chip cookies. I could hear her through the door, whispering to someone who never answered back, at least, not that I could hear from the hallway. She'd hum these creepy lullabies with no discernible melody, songs that seemed to come from some dark place in her memory. The tunes made my spine tingle and filled me with an inexplicable dread. They weren't like any lullabies I'd heard on television or that other moms sang to their children. These were different, older somehow, and deeply unsettling. Whenever she came out of that room, her eyes were red and puffy like she'd been crying for hours. Her mascara would be smeared, leaving dark tracks down her cheeks, and she'd immediately go to the bathroom to splash cold water on her face. Sometimes I'd catch her staring at family photos on the mantelpiece, particularly the ones from before I was born, with an expression of such profound sadness it made my heart ache. Dad became more withdrawn too. He'd come home from his job at Henderson Insurance Company and go straight to his home office, claiming he had paperwork to catch up on. But I could see him through the crack in the door, just sitting at his desk and staring at nothing, his hands folded in his lap like he was praying or trying to solve an impossible problem. Dinner-time conversations became stilted and awkward. We'd eat Mom's meatloaf or her famous tuna casserole in almost complete silence, the only sounds being the clink of silverware against plates and the occasional request to pass the salt. The easy warmth that had once filled our house seemed to drain away year by year, replaced by a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that made even simple conversations feel dangerous. By the time I reached high school at Millbrook Regional, the strange behavior in our house had become my normal. I'd learned to navigate around my parents' moods, to avoid asking questions that might trigger those terrifying silences, and to pretend I didn't hear the nightly tapping that continued without fail. But I wasn't a little girl anymore. At 16, I developed theories about what might be behind that locked door. Maybe my parents were hiding financial troubles. I'd heard whispers about the Henderson family down the street losing their house to foreclosure. Maybe Dad was having an affair and was using the room to call his mistress. Maybe Mom was suffering from some kind of mental illness and they were ashamed to tell me. None of these theories explained the tapping or the voice, though. I started paying closer attention to my parents' routines, watching them with the careful observation of a teenager who'd grown up sensing something was deeply wrong. Every morning, Dad would unlock the bedroom door with a key he kept on a separate keychain from his car keys, a small brass key that he guarded jealously. Mom would go in first, always carrying something: flowers from our garden, a glass of water, sometimes a small wrapped gift that looked like it belonged in a child's room. They'd stay inside for exactly 30 minutes before Dad locked the door again. During school breaks, when I was home, I'd time them. 30 minutes, every single morning, like clockwork. Whatever they were doing in there had become a ritual as precise and unchanging as religious service. I also noticed they never went in there together at any other time of day. It was always one or the other, never both, as if they were taking shifts or standing guard. Dad would go in around 8 in the evening, always carrying his coffee in the blue mug I'd made him in pottery class. Mom's visits were more random, sometimes in the afternoon while I was at school, sometimes late at night after she thought I was asleep. The gifts Mom carried into the room started bothering me more and more. They were always small, always wrapped in cheerful paper with cartoon characters or bright balloons. Birthday presents, Christmas gifts, Easter baskets. But whose birthday? Whose Christmas? I was their only child, and my presents were always given to me directly, usually in the living room by our artificial Christmas tree or at the kitchen table with my birthday cake. I began sneaking around the house during my parents' work hours, searching for clues. In Dad's home office, I found insurance papers, tax documents, and bank statements, but nothing unusual. In Mom's craft room, I discovered dozens of handmade items that looked like they were meant for a small child. Knitted blankets, wooden toys, stuffed animals that she'd sewn herself with careful, loving stitches. But the most disturbing discovery was in the basement storage room, behind boxes of Christmas decorations and old photo albums. There, carefully preserved in plastic containers, were baby clothes. Not my baby clothes. I recognized those from pictures, and they were pink and frilly. These clothes were blue and green, sized for a newborn, and they looked like they'd never been worn. The tags were still attached, the creases from the packaging still sharp and perfect. Last month, everything changed. I'd finally saved enough money from my part-time job at Murphy's Diner to get my own apartment across town in the Riverside district. At 17, I was ready to escape the oppressive atmosphere of our house on Maple Street and start fresh somewhere the walls didn't whisper and the nights weren't filled with mysterious tapping. But before I left, I had to know what was behind that door. This secret had been like a third parent my entire life, shaping every day and haunting every night. I couldn't walk away without understanding what had made my childhood home feel more like a prison than a place of love and safety. My plan was simple but required perfect timing. I'd wait for the right moment when both parents were out of the house simultaneously, something that rarely happened, but I was patient. I knew that Mom had a dentist appointment on Thursday afternoon and Dad had a client meeting that usually ran long. If everything went according to schedule, I'd have maybe 2 hours alone in the house. Thursday morning, I watched from my bedroom window as Dad's silver Honda Accord pulled out of our driveway at exactly 1:30 p.m. 20 minutes later, Mom left in her red Toyota Camry, waving goodbye to me through the kitchen window like she did every time she went anywhere. For the first time in years, the house was completely empty. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold anything steady. I'd located the spare key weeks earlier. Dad kept it in the old ceramic cookie jar shaped like a cow that sat on top of the refrigerator. The same jar where Mom used to hide my Halloween candy when I was little, thinking I didn't know where she put it. Walking down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom felt like approaching the edge of a cliff. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, and my heart was pounding so hard I was sure the neighbors could hear it. The familiar tapping wasn't happening. It never occurred during daylight hours, but somehow the silence felt even more ominous. I stood in front of that oak door for what felt like an eternity, the brass key warm and slippery in my sweaty palm. This was it. After 17 years of wondering, of lying awake at night listening to sounds that weren't supposed to exist, of watching my parents carry their terrible secret like a weight that grew heavier each year, I was finally going to learn the truth. The key slid into the lock easily, turning with a soft click that seemed to echo through the entire house. My hand trembled as I gripped the brass handle, took a deep breath that tasted like fear and anticipation, and slowly pushed the door open. The hinges creaked softly, a sound I'd never heard before because this door was never opened when I was around. Light from the hallway spilled into the room, illuminating what looked like a completely normal bedroom. There was my parents' queen-sized bed with its blue comforter, Dad's reading chair by the window, Mom's vanity table with her collection of perfume bottles. But something was wrong with the proportions of the room. I stepped inside and immediately noticed that the room felt smaller than it should have been. Having lived in this house my entire life, I knew the layout by heart. This bedroom should have been the same size as the master bathroom next door, but it felt cramped, like part of it was missing. The tapping was so much louder now that I was actually inside the room. It seemed to be coming from directly behind the large mahogany wardrobe that stood against the far wall, the same wall that separated this room from mine. My heart started racing as I realized the sound had been traveling through that shared wall all these years, from this room into mine. I pressed my ear against the wall behind the wardrobe and whispered, "Hello? Is someone there?" The tapping stopped completely. The silence was so sudden and absolute it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Then I heard it, and my blood went ice cold, a voice that was weak and raspy, like someone who hadn't spoken in years, or someone whose vocal cords had been damaged beyond repair. "Kill me," the voice whispered. "Please, kill me." I jerked back from the wall with my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. Someone was trapped back there. After 17 years of wondering, of being told I was imagining things, of living with this mystery that had poisoned my entire childhood, there was actually someone behind that wall. With adrenaline coursing through my veins, I grabbed the heavy mahogany wardrobe and pulled with everything I had. It was incredibly heavy, filled with my parents' clothes and linens, but desperation gave me strength I didn't know I possessed. The wooden legs scraped across the hardwood floor with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, revealing what I'd suspected but barely dared to hope, a hidden door painted to match the wall. The door was seamless, almost invisible when the wardrobe was in place. There was no lock, just a simple brass knob that had been polished so many times it gleamed like gold. My hand was trembling as I reached for it, knowing that whatever was behind this door would change everything I thought I knew about my family, about my life, about the very foundation of my existence. The knob turned easily in my hand, and the door swung open with a soft sigh, as if the room behind it had been holding its breath for years. What I saw inside made me gasp and take an involuntary step backward. It was a tiny room, maybe 6 feet by 8 feet, with no windows and only a single bare light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were painted a soft yellow, like a nursery, and they were covered with hand-drawn pictures in crayon, the kind of artwork a child might create, but faded and yellowed with age. The room was filled with baby clothes, stuffed animals, and toys that looked like they'd been carefully maintained but never actually played with. There were dozens of melted candles scattered around the room, their wax pooled on every surface like frozen tears. Photo albums were stacked in neat piles along the walls, and children's books were arranged on a small shelf as if someone had been reading them regularly. But dominating the center of the room was a small altar covered in yellowed white lace. I picked up one of the photo albums with hands that shook so violently I could barely hold it steady. On the cover, written in my mother's careful flowing handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed my permission slips and birthday cards, were 2 words that made my world tilt sideways: "Our Angel." Inside were pictures I'd never seen before, photos that had been hidden from me my entire life. My parents looked so young, maybe in their early 20s, and they were holding a beautiful baby boy with dark hair and enormous blue eyes. They looked radiant with joy, completely different from the broken, secretive people who had raised me. In every picture, they were smiling with a kind of pure happiness I'd never seen on their faces, not once in my 17 years of life. Dad was holding the baby up in the air, both of them laughing. Mom was nursing him in a rocking chair that I recognized from our attic, her face soft with love. There were pictures of a nursery decorated in blues and greens, with alphabet blocks and a mobile of smiling farm animals. Pictures of my parents walking through Highland Park with a baby stroller, feeding ducks at Morrison Lake, celebrating what looked like a first birthday with a tiny cake and a single candle. I had a brother. I'd had a brother, and somehow, impossibly, I'd never known he existed. With growing dread, I turned to look at the altar, and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. Lying on a silk pillow, surrounded by wilted flowers and burned-down candles, was the same baby from the photographs. But he wasn't a baby anymore, and he wasn't alive. He was a tiny mummified corpse, his skin like dried leather stretched over bird bones. His little hands were curled into permanent fists, and his mouth was frozen open in what looked like a silent scream of agony. The beautiful blue eyes from the photographs were now just empty sockets, dark and hollow like caves. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I could only stare at this impossible, horrible thing that had once been my brother, a brother I'd never known existed, who had been hidden from me behind this wall my entire life. With trembling fingers, I reached out and touched his tiny forehead. The moment my skin made contact with his, the world exploded. Visions flooded my mind like a dam had burst. I saw my parents in a hospital room at Millbrook General, younger versions of themselves holding each other and crying as a doctor with kind eyes delivered devastating news. "I'm so sorry, but your son didn't make it. Sometimes these things happen, and there's nothing anyone could have done." I saw my father's descent into madness, spending hours in the Millbrook Public Library researching ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge. I saw him drawing strange symbols on their bedroom floor with red chalk, symbols that hurt to look at directly, while chanting words in a language that made my teeth ache and my soul recoil. And I saw them place their dead baby on this same altar 17 years ago, performing some kind of ritual they'd found in books that should never have been written, books that promised to bring back what had been lost. But it didn't work the way they'd wanted it to. The ritual had worked, but it was all wrong. Instead of bringing my brother back to life, it had trapped his consciousness inside his dead body. For 17 years, my brother had been aware, able to think and feel, but unable to move or speak properly. All he could do was tap weakly on the wall that separated us, trying desperately to communicate his suffering to someone, anyone, who might be able to help him. The voice in my head was crystal clear now, no longer muffled by walls and distance. It was the voice of a child who had been forced to endure an existence worse than death, trapped in rotting flesh that should have been allowed to rest in peace decades ago. "Please," he whispered directly into my mind, his mental voice filled with exhaustion and pain that no human should ever have to bear. "Please kill me. I can't. I can't do this anymore. It hurts so much, and I'm so tired. I just want to sleep." Through our connection, I felt every second of his agony. Every year of being trapped in a decaying body that couldn't move or heal. Every moment of wanting to die but being unable to. Every night of tapping on that wall, hoping someone would hear him and understand that he needed to be freed from this torment. My parents had created this hell out of love. They couldn't bear to lose their first child, so they'd used forbidden knowledge to keep him with them. But in trying to cheat death, they'd condemned their son to something infinitely worse than the grave. I knew what I had to do. With tears streaming down my face, I wrapped his tiny body in a soft baby blanket from the pile of clothes, a blue one with little teddy bears that Mom had probably knitted herself. His body was so light, weighing almost nothing, like a bundle of dry sticks. I placed him gently in my duffel bag, the same bag I'd packed for my move to my new apartment. I left the hidden door wide open so my parents would know exactly what I'd done when they came home. They needed to understand that their secret was finally over, that their son was finally free. I drove for 3 hours in my old Honda Civic to an abandoned scrapyard outside Millbrook, a place where teenagers sometimes went to party and no one would ask questions about a small fire. Among the rusted cars and forgotten machinery, I built a small pyre with old newspapers and dry wood I found scattered around. "I'm sorry," I whispered to my brother as I laid his body on the flames. "I'm sorry you suffered for so long. I'm sorry I didn't know about you. I'm sorry it took me 17 years to set you free." As his body turned to ash, I felt his relief wash over me like a warm wave of gratitude. The weight that had pressed down on our house for 17 years suddenly lifted. The oppressive atmosphere that had poisoned my childhood evaporated like morning mist. Finally, after almost 2 decades of torment, my brother was at peace. But I had destroyed my family to save him. My parents would come home tonight to find the empty altar, and they would know that their greatest secret, and their greatest sin, had been discovered. I had freed my brother from his suffering, but in doing so, I had become something I never wanted to be. I had become the one who ended it all.